From the nation's capital, the American Enterprise Institute for Public Policy Research presents Public Policy Forums, a series of programs featuring the nation's top authorities presenting their differing views on the vital issues which confront us. Today's topic, forming a government under the Constitution.
This Public Policy Forum, one of a series presented by the American Enterprise Institute, is concerned with how our government organizes itself following a presidential election, and the ways in which the Constitution of the United States shapes the necessary powers the President and the Congress use. Our subject, forming a government under the Constitution. Our Constitution, written in 1787, provides that once the newly elected or re-elected President takes the oath of office, swearing to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States, he shall, from time to time, give to the Congress information of the state of the Union and recommend to their consideration such measures as he shall judge necessary and expedient. Further, he shall nominate, and by and with the advice and consent of the Senate, shall appoint ambassadors, other public ministers and consuls, judges of the Supreme Court, and all other officers of the United States. Note that these constitutional provisions refer to both the President and the Congress, thereby emphasizing one of the primary characteristics of our governmental system, the separation of the legislative and executive powers. The President, for his part, sets forth his program and nominates department heads, but only the Congress, by rules of its own making, legislates and controls the purse strings. Also, the Senate under our Constitution must confirm the President's cabinet and other major appointees. The pressing question is, do the requirements of the Constitution that form the contours of the relationship between President and Congress aid or hinder the formation of effective government after an election? For instance, Lloyd N. Cutler, counsel to President Jimmy Carter, wrote, "The separation of powers between the legislative and executive branches, whatever its merits in 1793, has become a structure that almost guarantees stalemate today. We elect one presidential candidate after another on the basis of our judgment of the overall program he presents, his ability to carry it out, and his capacity to adapt his program to new developments as they arise. But," says Mr. Cutler, "because we do not form a government, as they do in the parliamentary democracies, quote, we cannot fairly hold the President accountable for the success or failure of his overall program because he lacks the constitutional power to put the program into effect." What can a president early in his administration do to help him avoid stalemate with the Congress? How may the Congress organize itself to work effectively with the executive branch? Well, to examine these and other questions, we have a distinguished panel. To my far right, Mr. Stuart Eizenstat, currently with the law firm of Powell, Goldstein, Fraser, and Murphy. Mr. Eizenstat was from 1977 to 1981 President Jimmy Carter's executive director of the White House Domestic Policy Staff. He was one of the principal authors of the Democratic Party platform in 1976 and was director of policy planning and analysis in the Carter-Mondale Transition Planning Group following President Carter's election. To my immediate right is the Honorable Richard Bolling, former Democratic congressman from the 5th District of Missouri. Mr. Bolling served for 34 years in the Congress, became chairman of the powerful House Rules Committee in 1979. He is considered to have been one of the major moving forces behind reform of the House committee seniority system, having written 2 books in the 1960s entitled House Out of Order, a very good title, and Power in the House, that were influential in the movement to reform House procedures. To my immediate left, Dr. Herbert Stein, senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. Dr. Stein is a former member and chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors under Presidents Nixon and Ford. He is the author most recently of Presidential Economics, The Making of Economic Policy from Roosevelt to Reagan and Beyond. To my far left is Mr. David Gergen, who until January of 1984 was Director of Communications in the Reagan White House. Mr. Gergen has served a total of 8 of the past 13 years in the White House as a member of President Richard Nixon's speechwriting and research team, as special counsel to President Gerald Ford. During the late 1970s, Mr. Gergen helped found and edit AEI's Public Opinion magazine. I should mention here that both Mr. Bolling, a Democrat, and Mr. Gergen, a Republican, are visiting fellows at AEI. Now, to begin with, let me ask the same question of each of you. We often hear about the initial honeymoon the President and the Congress go on just after a presidential election, but it ordinarily doesn't last very long, and people complain that urgent problems aren't being solved. Are the expectations we have of our government too high, or has the capacity of our governmental system simply not kept pace with what the government of a superpower must do in the world of the 20th century? Mr. Eizenstat.
You know, our founding fathers created a government which, John, as you mentioned, has a separation of powers. And those of us like myself who have worked for presidents in the White House always bemoan the fact that presidential authority is not any greater. But that's when we agree with what the president wants. When we're on the outside and we disagree with what a particular president wants, then we think the checks and balances work just fine. And in fact, the system is working just as the founding fathers wanted it to work. The real answer to your question is that there is a very narrow window after a president is elected. This goes back to FDR, Johnson in his landslide, President Reagan in 1980, and you have to use that window in an effective way. We in the Carter years did not use that initial period effectively and really squandered that honeymoon period. You have to focus on 1 or 2 very key priorities, and you'll get those priorities passed during that honeymoon period.
Mr. Congressman?
Well, in the time that you mentioned, I served with 8 presidents, and each one was very different in the way that he established his government, his part of government, and the response of the Congress was equally different from one time to another. It seems to me that none of the presidents with whom I've served have been able to maximize the opportunity to exercise their power over a long period of time. Part of that is the 22nd Amendment, which gives them only 2 terms. Part of it is the kind of difficulty that has caused very few presidents to serve 2 terms. But it seems to me that we can do rather better. And I think one of the things that's very important about discussions like this is that it is much too little studied in a practical way. Usually people come in with very large suggestions for very large changes, which are very impractical, such as a series of constitutional amendments, instead of looking at the possibilities. I think there are enormous possibilities in that window of opportunity and in the situations that remain after the window of opportunity closes. And I think they can be examined. I think they can be shown to be inadequately used because too many of our presidents haven't been very well trained in American history.
Dr. Stein.
Well, I'd like to say something about this honeymoon idea. I think it's greatly overrated and has turned out to be a trap for many presidents. That is, almost all presidents come into office with a vision of Franklin Roosevelt in his first 100 days before them and the wonders that were then achieved, not realizing that about half of the things that were done in those first 100 days were terrible mistakes and much of it unconstitutional. So presidents come in with a desire to do something rapidly, and they don't really know what to do in those 100 days. It isn't as if presidents come in with some very well-tailored plan which needs to be executed and which they can't get through. I've written, on the occasion of 2 presidents coming into office, that they should spend their first 100 days up in Camp David thinking, and not making any speeches, not making any proposals to Congress, but trying to figure out what to do, because the fact is that in the 2 or 3 years before they got elected, they certainly weren't thinking about what they ought to do. They were doing, in fact, and most of what they said about what they ought to do was just for public consumption and not for enactment. So I think we got off on the wrong foot if we ask ourselves, how can we arrange things so that the presidents will get enacted what they thought ought to be done in the first 100 days? First, they ought to think of something good to do.
Gergen.
Well, I don't think there's any question but that a good honeymoon in the presidency does not guarantee a long marriage. And we've seen that time and time again in various presidencies of recent years. I would have to tell you, though, I think that the Reagan experience in the first term suggests that perhaps we ought to be rethinking our ideas about the presidency. When he first came in, there was a good deal of pessimism in the literature about the ability to govern in this country. And I can't say that people agree with everything he did in the first term, but many of his critics would now say that at least he proved during that first term that there were powers there in the presidency, perhaps latent, which still could be used effectively, and which indicated that a man still could, or hopefully a woman soon, could govern in that office. As recently as the report done by the Urban Institute on the Reagan first term. They had many criticisms of his policies, but they pointed out very strongly that his ability to govern had surprised even them. And I think that's partly because he understood when he came in, as Stu said, this window that you had of opportunity and used that skillfully. He also had a very clear philosophy and a set of clear goals. And we can discuss whether, how some of that was carried out and some of the waning of power that perhaps occurred in the latter part of his first term. I think the more interesting question that now confronts the country is it possible to govern in a second term? And I think the jury is still very much out on that. We haven't had a second term president, after all, who's served a full term, obviously, since Eisenhower, and I don't think any of us yet knows what it's going to be like to go through this process. The early indications are that the challenges are in fact more difficult, and that it is in fact more difficult to work with the Congress and to govern successfully.
I think one thing's been said that really bothers me, and that is the notion that a president comes in without any ideas. There's a view that a lot of people hold that view, but that certainly was not my original experience. The man that I first served with was Harry Truman, and he had a lot of ideas. They were the ideas that he expressed in the campaign. And the reason that he had the surprise election was that the people who voted rather lightly perceived that he had some ideas and that they were different from the opposition's. I don't want to sound naive about this. I ran 17 different times in general elections in relatively tough territory, and I think I know how to deal with the politics of it. But ideas go very well in campaigns. It's only relatively recently in media campaigns that they have been left out. And it seems to me we should get back to the basic point. And the basic point is that people are elected to govern with ideas and programs, and that should be one of the first demands. The fact that we haven't been able to do it recently doesn't mean that it can't be done again.
I didn't say that they didn't come in with ideas. I said they didn't come in with well-articulated and realistic ideas. And the process of campaigning puts a great premium, as we've seen over and over again, on all kinds of promises, which turn out to be a great encumbrance upon the president once he gets into office. And I think in Mr. Gurgen's experience of President Reagan's ability in the first term to get his ideas across, well, it has never been very difficult to sell the American people on having their taxes reduced by 25%. I mean, that was not a great act of management or leadership in my opinion. But I think there is also a kind of struggle to develop ideas, to create a program even when it doesn't exist, for the sake of having something that you can, some package to present in the first 100 days. I think that the problems are never such that they need to be dealt with in the 100 days and could not benefit from some more mature consideration than will have been given during the campaign.
Mr. Eizenstat?
I'd like to tie these points together with my earlier point about a window of opportunity. If a president comes into office and uses his first several months to implement what the public expects from his campaign will be his main emphasis, then he will succeed. That's what President Reagan did. Everyone knew that what he wanted was a series of budget cuts and tax cuts. That became his primary focus. On the other hand, when President Carter came into office in 1977, contrast our program in the first year with the focused Reagan program. We proposed, for example, an energy program, which I think was a good program, but it came outside any campaign context. Dick, it wasn't a part of the debate. People didn't expect it. The Congress didn't expect it. It came out of context. So if you carry one or two main campaign ideas into that window of opportunity at the beginning, then you're going to have, at least during that period, until your popularity, as it inevitably will begin to wane, considerable success. The problem is when you disperse your resources and when you focus on issues that have not been discussed during the campaign and which the Congress and the public have no anticipation will be coming.
Gergen?
I absolutely agree with that. And Stu, I think that, for instance, the energy plan that Jim Schlesinger worked up there in that first 90 days of the Carter administration, had that been developed prior to the campaign or during the campaign, and could you, Mr. Carter, have spoken out on that, he would have had a much better chance of getting that enacted in 1977 instead of the kind of problems that you engaged in. It seems to me the responsibility is on these candidates to do their thinking, and this is not said with particular reference to Mr. Carter, but to do their thinking before they start campaigning and to answer the question in their own minds, why do they want to be president? What is it they want to do with that office? You remember that was the question that Teddy Kennedy couldn't answer in the famous Roger Mudd interview, because he really hadn't thought that clearly about what he wanted to do. And I think the period of thinking has to be done before you run or while you're running, because it does seem to be once you get in, you have to hit the ground running. That is your opportunity when the public is paying attention, close attention to what you want to do, to get moving with the public and with the Congress and get something enacted. I think if you wait 6 months down the road, the train has probably left the station in terms of how much you can accomplish.
Dr. Stein?
I think part of our problem is that while we may have ideas or programs in the minds of a presidential candidate, we don't have any party ideas. We don't have any. The president comes in with a set of ideas which are his ideas, but not necessarily the ideas of his party. And it seems to me that the party mechanism is very deficient in its operation, especially the party that's out of power, in the development of a program which can then become the program of its candidate.
Well, I think one aspect of that is certainly true. It's difficult in a campaign, and our campaigns are very long, to do much consecutive thinking. But I can cite several examples, and not all of them are Democratic examples, where the administration came in with a pretty good, broad set of ideas that it intended to implement. The next step, which we haven't really mentioned, is that the window of opportunity is where? It's with the people and it's with the Congress. And it's perfectly true that what Stu has said about the Carter administration and energy was half the case. We managed to get the Carter program through the House in a rather healthy fashion, because we were organized to do it and used the devices that were available then to do it, and it fell in the Senate for a variety of reasons that involve a concentration on the House. What happened in the Reagan 1981 is that he came in with some very broad notions on taxes, some more specific ones on cuts, and was able to bring together the votes to pass it. It was a phenomenal performance, but the real significance of the performance was that he did get every Republican, with perhaps one or two exceptions, and he managed to pick up enough Democrats. And the reason that you can't make your program a party program in advance of a president is that the parties are split. Even the Republicans are split today under a Republican president, and the Democrats are split three ways.
Mr. Eizenstat?
I think this point about parties that Professor Stein and Dick mentioned goes to the very heart of the real problem of governing under our system. And that is, in a parliamentary system where you have a merger of your executive and legislative branch, the party means something. You have a shadow cabinet when the opposition party is not in power. That shadow cabinet works together. They develop plans and white papers together, and then if they are elected, they can implement those programs, and the shadow cabinet becomes the real cabinet. In our system, on the other hand, we have totally bifurcated and separated presidential politics from congressional politics, and those people who can implement a president's program, namely the members of Congress, have virtually no role in either developing his program as he runs or helping him get nominated. And unless we merge the two, the congressional and the presidential politics, into a stronger party organization, then we're going to continue to have this legislative presidential impasse. For example, again, contrast with parliamentary system where you have shadow cabinets used to working together. Most presidents of the United States, and I include, I believe, President Reagan and Ford and Carter, barely knew the majority of cabinet members they appointed. They may have worked with them incidentally 10 years ago, or had met them at a cocktail party, or had them on a task force and met with them once. And that's no way to govern.
No, but that historically is the way we have governed.
Well, there have been exceptions when you take the congressional end, and it seems to me it's important to look a long way back in history. There's no reason why Congress today can't be organized. And I think it's fair to say that it isn't very well organized in terms of any party activity or any programmatic activity. It isn't a partisan matter. But you can create organization in Congress. And it was done for a very long time under Republicans in the latter part of the last century and the early part of this one. And there's nothing really impossible about creating congressional committee party government, which is fair to the democratic process. It requires there being a team at the leadership of both parties in each body. It's not impossible. It's really rather convenient and easy to do if you could just sell the idea. The Republicans already do that.
Mr. Congressman, did not the reforms which the party, particularly the Democratic Party, initiated following 1948, watering down and diluting the cooperative base of congressional leadership and the party leadership and the process of convention, etc., kind of strip the gears for exactly the kind of interior discipline within the whole body politic of a party if it's going to be able to show leadership?
My analysis would be a little bit different. What happened in the Congress, particularly in the House and the Senate, was that there was an appearance that the Democrats were in the majority, and they were technically, but in terms of ideas and the national party view, the presidential view, the Democrats were actually most of the time in the minority. There was not a majority for the Roosevelt program, even in defense and taxes under defense, during most of that period. The first time that there came to be a real Democratic majority where there was a voting number of majority that were capable of passing bills was much later than that. It wasn't even in the Truman administration, except on foreign policy. A careful analysis shows that the problem is that there's been a misinterpretation about what party was in power in the Congress.
In the whole issue of what needs to be done or can be done to come to grips with at least the two major areas which need examination, is constitutional amendment necessary to bring about shall we say, a more cohesive, effective, efficient United States government?
Well, John, in your introduction, you quoted my former White House colleague, Lloyd Cutler, who believes that there should be such and that we ought to have a parliamentary system. While I am intrigued by the ease of governing in a parliamentary system, I think it would be, A, very difficult to ever accomplish and therefore not worth our time and resources, and B, if we ever had a parliamentary system, we'd probably have 5 or 6 parties because of the great diversity in our country. The places where parliamentary systems work are places where you have a relatively homogeneous population, which we do not have. What I'd like to see are some changes within the context of our current government and without the need of going through the trauma of a constitutional amendment. For example, I would like to see a system in which the elected officials, the Dick Bollings, have the predominant say-so, not the interest groups, in the nomination of a candidate for their party and in the drafting of the platform. So David, when that president is nominated, the platform would be one that he and the members of Congress had written, not one that was written by outside interest groups. Second, I would like to see a system, and I believe the caucuses, Dick, could do this, in which the Democrats in the House, the Republicans in the Senate would say, we are going to permit a president to have 3 to 5 votes on his bills on the floor. We will not permit a situation in which a committee can block a president's proposal. We'll give him an up or down vote, let the Rules Committee pass that along with bills that come out of the committee, so that a president at least has a chance to get his major legislative and budget priorities voted on up or down, so that he can exercise his maximum power. Now, that can be done within our own constitutional authority.
And it was done. It was an unwritten rule when Rayburn was the Speaker, and he was for a very long time, that on a major matter, the President should have an opportunity to have a vote, whether Rayburn was for it or not. One of the dilemmas that we have today is that we forget that we have made the institutions work when there was a little more civility, a little more understanding that the government had to work in many ways in a bipartisan way. There is no way, in my judgment, to make this government work effectively for a long period of time unless there is effective partisan communication.
Well, I think that's a very good point, that maybe we started with the wrong premise, in which was that the government doesn't work. And in fact, if you look at the results in our system, the government does seem to work very well. We come up to various brinks, but we always recoil from the brink. When things get very bad, we manage. Of course, my guru in this field is Bryce Harlow, who's had so much experience in dealing with the Congress, and he says, well, Congress always insists on its prerogatives until some matter of grave responsibility arises, and then they're very happy to leave the responsibility to the President. And that's the way in which we make very difficult decisions. So things has not worked so badly. And another thing I think we have to say is we cannot expect constitutional amendments to solve all the problems of responsibility and intelligence in managing our affairs. That is, if we don't have that, there's no constitutional amendment that's going to save us. I think at some time we ought to talk about the responsibility of the public, because all these people, presidents and Congress, operate within the limits of what some kind of private leadership out there will support. And I think that's the thing that has been lacking here in this country a great deal in the last 30 years or so, some responsible public opinion out there other than what emanates from Washington.
I'm glad that the conversation has come more to the view that, in fact, we do not have as much of a stalemate or lack the kind of political courage in the system that I think was suggested earlier. It does seem to me that there is better reason to be encouraged about this system today than there was 5 years ago. If I had been in Stu's position leaving the Carter White House with the kind of problems you encountered, which were very real, I think I would have been discouraged about our ability to govern. Because it seems to me you had some very well-crafted proposals that you had trouble dealing with the Congress on, and for a variety of reasons, which we don't need to get into. But I think that in the last few years, yes, we enacted major tax cuts, and those weren't hard. But we also enacted tax increases. We also enacted the Social Security bill, the Social Security bill in the Carter administration. Both those were tough bills to enact. It took some political courage to get them done. I personally, the more you look at these constitutional amendments, I think the less attractive they become as a way to resolve or solve whatever problems do exist. In particular, the question of the 6-year term, which has been batted around a good deal in the last few years. My hunch is that the further we get into the second Reagan term, the less popular that idea is going to be. That people are going to begin to recognize more and more the difficulties of a lame duck. If anything, I think we ought to repeal the 22nd Amendment. Which was a bad idea, it's anti-democratic, and it was based on, I think, not a whim, but certainly the passions of the time, which in retrospect, I think we'd be better off without it. But if we were going to be doing things, I think that Stu is pushing the right button and say, let's strengthen the parties. Let's find a way to make the parties and the candidates more synonymous and make the ideas of the parties more powerful. One idea, the only constitutional amendment that has ever appealed to me personally has been the suggestion that you make the congressmen and women run on a coterminous basis with the president, that their elections be every 4 years, the Senate elections be every 6, but allow a president to come in with a fresh Congress, and those people don't have to stand again until 4 years later, and they really have, I think they ride and fall together.
What do you say then to the argument which has been made that the 2-year terms for the House of Representatives are an instrument by which the people, dissatisfied with the first 2 years of a president's governing, can make their dissatisfaction loud and clearly known?
Well, I think we've come a long way in being able to sense public dissatisfaction, being able to measure it fairly well. But if you had the Senate elections based every 6 years, you would have a third of the Senate up every 2 years, and there would be an obvious way for the public to register its views. I think that there are a lot of destructive elements in forcing a congressman to have to go back and run every 2 years. It would be far better if they had the time to worry about long-term policy questions, and we looked at some issues like that, which strengthened their hand and also made them co-responsible with the president for the fate of the agenda of the president and the Congress.
John, I've been on both sides of that. So
I was going to say, you played a very large hand in some of the reforms of recent years.
Well, the idea of a four-year term is attractive naturally to a man who has to run all the time. But I don't think it's so bad to have people from one body who are that freshly attending to their constituency. I think the 2-year term is an absolutely essential safety valve. I think there are other ways to fiddle with the elections a little bit that perhaps don't involve a constitutional amendment, but I'm not sure on that. But I'm very sure that as one congressman, I'm against the 4-year term.
Mr. Eizenstat?
We have had in this country cycles of greater presidential authority and other cycles of greater congressional authority. Now, President Reagan has perhaps reversed, in part, what was clearly a 10-year period after Watergate, the resignation of President Nixon, the Vietnam War, the Cambodia experience, of a major shift of power away from the president to the Congress. But he only has partially done it. If you look at the powers that have been removed from the president over the last decade, he no longer has credit control or wage and price authority. The Congress has imposed a series of legislative vetoes which limit his capacity to issue regulations. The Congressional Budget Office has been created, which take away the president's monopoly on budget forecasting and economic forecasting. The staffs of the Congress have grown tremendously. Now, all of these things are important if you're going to have a Congress which works, but I don't think we should be under any illusion that they haven't come at the expense of a president's capacity to govern, because they have.
Let me come particularly, Dr. Stein, to the issue of economics, which is playing such a large role domestically, internationally. You've taken a long, hard look at what you call presidential economics, have said in the past that most people would agree that our governing processes have many deficiencies and that many focus on the budget. Since the early 70s, we've had a budget process, a very broadly based budget process. What needs to be done?
Well, I think that's a good example of a problem which is unlikely to be solved by procedural change. That is, there are a lot of proposals, one of which is that we should have a constitutional amendment requiring a balanced budget. I don't think that solves the problem, or will solve the problem, even if we had it. I think that this is a case in which the difficulty is with the understanding of the policy, of its significance, of its requirements, and that would not be overcome by some change in organization. And I think somebody needs to take the lead in improving national understanding of this. And there I go back to the nostalgia that I share with Congressman Bolling for those days after World War II, when we did seem able to make a national policy in a less partisan way, and where there was a lot of leadership from the private sector. I think our problem about the budget is not that we are not getting the budget that the people want. I think we are getting the budget that the people want, but the people don't understand what's good for them. And somebody needs to tell them that, and it's unlikely to be the president who will tell them that, because that's not the business that presidents are in. They're not in the business of telling people that things are tough. And so somebody has to tell them that. I think that we are seeing the rise of some public spokesmen who are telling that message is getting across, and that's how it will be solved. I don't think it will be solved by an organizational change.
I agree with the thrust of that, but I really disagree with the notion that it isn't the president's responsibility and the members of Congress and the Senate's responsibility to say things are tough. In my judgment, it's not true that the people of this country will put up with that. They may not put up with it for an election, but by and large, they're willing to face the troubles. And I think the real magic in Harry Truman's experience is that, number one, he was able to say what he believed. He got elected because he said it. His popularity went down to 23% because of the Korean War. And who is the person that is generally the most popular president not living today? Harry Truman.
Well, that's a way to acquire popularity, but I basically agree with what you've said, and I'm not denying that it is the president's responsibility. I'm just making a kind of unhappy prediction that it will not be fulfilled, and that we have to look to others to fulfill that responsibility. I certainly hope that presidents will do that. I think you are right. In my opinion, you have much better basis for saying this than I do, but I do think that many politicians are unduly cynical about the American people and about what they will stand for, and are unwilling to talk candidly to them because they're afraid that the public will not stand for it, and I think the public would welcome it.
Well, now, I think it is fair from what you have said to deduce that you do not, any of you, feel that constitutional amendment is necessarily a good road to take. And there are other roads which you have begun to discuss. It has been suggested to help get at some of these problems and resolve them. We ought to have a bipartisan coalition government for at least one presidential term. Do any of you think that this might work, that it would be useful, and what would be the process of forming such a coalition government? Who would like to start that one?
Well, it's possible, but I don't think it's possible in any orderly fashion. The first thing that has to happen is that a president has to come in who really believes that he has to function by bipartisanship. And he looks at what he's got in the Congress to deal with in the House and the Senate. And he figures out how many people he's got in his party, and he figures out how many people he's got in the other party that he can get in different approaches to the same problem. The classic example of this being done is that matter of Social Security. The first thing that came up from the administration was so unacceptable that we sort of set it up to use it as a political whipping boy, we Democrats. And after that had gone on for a while and everybody began to see that there was no way out that was going to be partisanly beneficial, that it could only be done by a bipartisan effort, we began to maneuver on the Hill and in the White House, different people, on how we could get together a commission that would have the good sense to deal with all the difficult things in a way that wasn't nonpartisan, but it was partisan in a balanced way. And they came out with a bill that offended everybody somewhat, but was still possible to pass. And that's exactly how the Greenspan Commission worked, and it's exactly how it came into being. So I think the bipartisan approach, which is seldom acknowledged, often plays a larger role than people are willing to say in a campaign, and I think it's demonstrable that we can do a great deal on that. I personally am not prepared to say that I might not be for a constitutional amendment. A group is still trying to look at that. My judgment is that the probability is that there won't be.
Mr. Eizenstat?
If what we mean by bipartisan government is having every third cabinet officer a Democrat in a Republican administration or vice versa, that really creates an artificial sense that you're trying to be bipartisan. Dick's point is the one that really matters, and that is, even if you're a Democrat and all your cabinet officers are Democrats, or you're a Republican president and all your cabinet officers are Republicans, the key is forging in the Congress, where it counts, a bipartisan consensus, and that can be done. Let me give you an example in a very difficult area. That was the Panama Canal Treaty. And the Panama Canal Treaty was a terribly divisive issue. It was one which tore the public apart in many ways and which separated people in the Senate. And yet, we would not have passed that treaty and had it ratified had it not been for Howard Baker. Howard Baker, in an act of bipartisanship, helped support that and helped get it through. And that's the way in which you govern, not by creating an artificial bipartisan cabinet.
He might just as soon you forget that.
Well, he'll be reminded of it frequently.
Well, because we will have to move to our question and answer session soon, take up one more issue. The New York Times quoted one aide to the Senate leadership thus: We've gone from older people to younger people, from more experienced legislative types to less experienced types, from guys who know you don't always get your way to those who are bound and determined to get their way no matter what. There's a lack of a sense of responsibility in governing. They don't think they have to be part of a compromise. If you get enough of these people around, the place will grind to a halt, and it often has. He describes it as monkey-wrench politics, which Majority Leader Bob Dole says has almost become standard. And in the House, the Minority Leader, Bob Michael, said that he is alarmed by this individualism, and that when individualism becomes an epidemic, it will destroy us. Now, do you think that is a major element?
Well, I think it has been a major element, and I think to a very great degree it's beginning to stop, because the people that came in both on the Republican side and the Democratic side in the House in 1974, 1976 were rather unusual. They were almost not interested in party, at least on the Democratic side. They were interested in changing government, and they were interested in stopping the Vietnam War. And they came in on their own steam. They didn't get much party help. They knew how to handle the media, they knew how to raise money, and they came in as very independent people. The brightest of them, and there are an enormous number of very bright ones in those classes, and the later classes, they began to learn that you can't pass legislation without majorities. So they learned that independence is not enough in the legislative battles. It may be in the political battles, but not the legislative battles.
Right, we have, I think, got a very large canvas, and that it's big enough now, so it's time to give our audience the opportunity to ask this distinguished panel questions, and so we'll move to the question and answer session. May I have the first question, please?
I'm Walter Burns of the American Enterprise Institute. My question is this: I wonder why the presidential power, or the president's power, should be greater during the 100 days honeymoon period, as you describe it, than it is during the rest of his term. Or to ask the question metaphorically, the panel's metaphor, not mine, why should the window of opportunity be open during that period and closed in another? And to be still more precise, why should the constitutional structure allow that window to be open during that period and not open during the rest of the term?
Mr. Eizenstat?
The answer gets to the nature of our government. When Margaret Thatcher, before the Falklands invasion, was at 25% popularity, she could still govern because she had a parliamentary majority with a tight party discipline. In our system, a president's only real power is his capacity to mobilize public opinion. It is what Neustadt and Truman called the power of persuasion. That power of persuasion markedly declines after a president's first year, absent some other unusual situation, because he has to take so many decisions that are so unpopular, and because of the diffusion of our governmental power, so that when he is at 25% popularity, as for example President Carter was toward the end of his term, he cannot govern effectively as the way a prime minister does, because our system doesn't permit it. That 25% translates to the Congress, which has to implement his programs, into a lack of public support for those programs.
Yes, Mr. Gergen?
I'd like to add to that. I don't think there's anything written into the system about this 100 days or the fact that power disappears. It does seem to me power in the city is very ephemeral, and it does slip away from a president very easily. The 100-day period or something there in the early months gives a president a chance to lay a foundation for his program. If that program is successful, I think power then can be built on power. Once he has got a successful start, or as in Reagan's case, for instance, power slipped away from him in year 2, but as the economy came back on in year 3, power began to flow back toward the presidency, and he was able to go on and do some other things. It's really a question of whether you seize that opportunity to do the kind of things early that then restore and give you a foundation later on to govern successfully.
Next question, please.
My name is Robert Ross from Southeastern University. The window of opportunity of which President Reagan took such great advantage in the first year of his presidency, if you look at the numbers, there was a remarkable solidarity within the congressional Republicans. Not that there was much change in the voting patterns of the congressional Democrats. Doesn't this indicate that to make the system work, a president must not simply be a leader of the country, but also a leader of his party?
That's the point that I was making earlier. It seems to me that the Republicans have come as close as any political party has during the 1980s in building a national political party. We, as Democrats, have not yet done that. And the reason I think that we had the kind of solidarity that you referred to and that Dick talked about when the president was trying to pass his 81 budget cuts is because they did run on the same platform. They did run as a national party. Their advertising was done nationally. The Republican National Committee became a real functioning institution. And so they therefore came as close as we have come in modern times to really having a national party in which the congressional wing and the presidential wing felt a unity of purpose.
Dr. Stein?
Well, I think that the 1981 experience illustrates Dave Gurgen's point that there's a lot going on in the country besides the passage of this 100 days, because Mr. Reagan had a great few months at the beginning, but around Labor Day in 1981, the stock market began to decline, the bond market began to decline, interest rates were rising, and it became apparent that we weren't getting this great upsurge of economy that had been expected from the program which had just been adopted. And then suddenly people began to ask questions, and there was talk about the need for a tax increase. And we soon, by December of that year, were confronting this monstrous $100 billion deficit, which had not been expected. So that what happened was not merely that more than 100 days had passed since Inauguration Day, but that a lot of the bloom had gone off the program. And that, of course, had something to do with the loss of ability to sell the country and the Congress.
Okay. Next question, please.
David Cohen, Institute for Public Policy Advocacy. As a means of strengthening political parties and governing, I'd like to know how the panel would react to the idea of each party assembling its congressional office holders, governors, and state legislative leaders after the election to try and hammer out what its priorities would be over the next 2 years.
Mr. Bolling, you want to start that one?
I think it'd be a good exercise, sort of like the midterm conventions. I'm not sure that I see exactly how it would come out. My impression is that the Democratic Party is still sufficiently divided so that it would be perhaps a little bit raucous and might tend to set things up so that there would be a division, as there was back in Stevenson days, between the National Committee types and the congressional types. You'll remember that back in those days, the Democrats tried to have a National Committee that was led by leaders, including congressional leaders, and the two congressional leaders turned down the opportunity, and we ended up with two policy groups working for the same party, and it was really rather awkward. But I would think it would be a very good idea to get those people together fairly systematically over a period of time so they would get to know each other. Some efforts were made to do that during the Carter administration, as I remember it, and they were useful and would have been more useful if we could have done more of it.
Gergen?
Well, their all-powerful staffs might veto the idea, so I guess you'd have a hard time probably getting it through. But I think we ought to be exploring a lot of different ways to bring the parties together and give them more of an opportunity and more of a voice in national affairs as parties. For instance, I have thought we ought to at least explore the idea of the television networks providing to the parties on a regular basis, not just an election campaign, but during the year, each year, time when they could go to the country and discuss the issues before the country, to give each party a half an hour or an hour back to back, and let the parties decide who's going to speak for them, and have a serious dialogue about the nature of the problems that are out there.
All right, next question. Yes, sir, please.
I'm John Kendrick of the George Washington University. Bipartisanship sounds good, but is it realistic, considering the basically adversarial nature of democracy? A case in point is with respect to foreign policy at present. In contrast to bipartisanship at the time of the Berlin crisis, when Congressman Bolling first came to Washington, Now, there seems to be a good deal of divisiveness over our policies in Central America, where it seems to me our vital national interests are involved. And if we can't get bipartisanship there, is it realistic to think we can get it in almost any situation?
I think I would say that it was provable that bipartisanship could be made to work, but not in every case. There are ways in which presidents can have considerable influence even on people who vote against them. And one has to know how to deal with Congress in a non-adversary way as well as an adversary way. A lot of what happened in 1982 was to too great a degree left to Congress to work out among itself. Howard Baker had to do all kinds of things on that tax increase that no majority leader in the Senate should have to do.
Well, I think in a way the question answers itself, because Mr. Kendrick believes, and I agree with him, that there's a vital national interest down there in Central America, but there are an awful lot of people who don't. And if they all, I'm sure that Congress, all members of Congress would rally around if they had the same view of what the vital national interest was. But they don't, and we're greatly divided about such things, and no amount of structural change is going to influence that. The thing that we had after World War II was a very common view of what the vital national interest was. And before we got into World War II, we were quite divided about that. The fact that Mr. Roosevelt was a great leader did not enable him to get the things that he wanted done about our defense program and foreign policy and so on. We did come out at a certain moment with a consensus about the national interest, and we don't have it now. I'm sure that there are circumstances, if the Berlin Wall, if the Berlin blockade arose again, we probably, can't be sure, would probably have a consensus that there was a vital national interest. But who knows about Nicaragua?
Anybody else with it? Next question, please. Yes, sir.
Pursuing Mr. Gurgen's suggestion of a 4-year House term.
Would you identify yourself and affiliation?
Yes, Pete Schaufler with the Committee on the Constitutional System. I wonder if Mr. Bolling's idea of the safety valve could perhaps be achieved by some type of public referendum in the event of a major stalemate during a 4-year term.
Well, it's certainly my objection to the safety valve problem in a 4-year term would be taken care of if we could devise a technique. And as you know, that's come up in our discussions, and that's one of the reasons that I had my caveat when I said I was not prepared to say that I was against all constitutional changes at this stage. I think if we could figure out how there'd be that safety valve, and there are a lot of ingenious suggestions, then I wouldn't have any objection to the 4-year term.
Anybody else want to talk to that?
I think what animated David's suggestion, and I'm not necessarily endorsing it, goes to the point again of the division of responsibility between the two branches and the lack of elected official involvement and participation in the nomination and election of our president. What happens when a president's popularity wanes is that the members of Congress, including the members of his own party, run away from him as if he were a pariah, or indeed attack him like a shark would somebody wounded in water. It is when he can show that he has personal and public popularity that they will come to his side. But the key problem is that unless a president can maintain that personal popularity, David mentions 81 he had it because of the honeymoon period, 82 he lost it because of the recession, 83 he got some of it back because of the recovery. But unless that popularity can be sustained around the 45 to 50 degree level, he cannot effectively govern, and our system doesn't permit him to do so.
Dr. Stein?
Well, I think we may have a different notion of what it means to govern. That is, to govern doesn't mean that the president gets his way. We have this division of powers for what people thought was a very good reason, and that was to prevent the government from being too powerful and prevent the executive from being too powerful. And I think that there have been a number of occasions, I'm sure, in which what looked to the president like stalemate and inability to govern was really very prudent situation for the country. And I'm not sure that all the cases in which presidents demonstrated their great ability to govern were in the end wise or beneficial. So I think this does relate somewhat to the question of the national referendum. We have deliberately created a system in which we don't take a public poll on major issues. We operate through a representative system in which there's some sand in the machinery that keeps the government from running away with everything, and I think that's a very beneficial idea.
Well, I certainly agree that there's no monopoly on wisdom at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. It does seem to me that it's been true time and again that absent presidential leadership and absent the ability of a president to make decisions that have some authority in Congress, that we get very little action. The most recent incident, I think, has been over this tax reform issue, in which the Treasury Department has put its head together and come up with what many regard as a very intelligent proposal. Others might disagree with that. But the initial reaction in Congress was, we're not going to get tax reform unless the president takes the lead. There was no indication that anyone in Congress was willing to stand up and be counted on the issue unless the president got out front. And I think that we see that time and time again in our national life, that unless we have an effective president, we don't have effective government.
Well, this concludes another public policy forum presented by the American Enterprise Institute for Public Policy Research. On behalf of AEI, our hearty thanks to the distinguished and expert panelists, Mr. Stuart Eizenstat, the Honorable Richard Bolling, Dr. Herbert Stein, and Mr. David Gergen. We'd also like to thank our guests and experts in the audience for their participation. Goodbye from Washington.
It is the aim of AEI to clarify issues of the day by presenting many viewpoints, in the hope that by doing so, those who wish to learn about the decision-making process will benefit from such a free exchange of informed and enlightened opinion. This Public Policy Forum series is created and supplied to this station as a public service by the American Enterprise Institute, Washington, D.C. AEI is a nonprofit, nonpartisan, publicly supported research and education organization. For a transcript of this program, send $3.75 to the American Enterprise Institute, 1150 17th Street Northwest, Washington, D.C. 20036.